Hey guys, so you'll have to bear with me because I'm a little bit sick. This video is devoted to Lonerbox's new video of his own on the Great March of Return. It's simply a bizarre video that Loner made. Just bizarre. Bone-chilling, really disturbing, creepy. Well, the guy admits Israel committed mass murder during the Great March of Return. Let me repeat that. He admits Israel committed mass murder during the Great March of Return.
Yeah, some of these kills were just murders, I think. I think that's probably fairly easy to say.
Yet, in spite of that, he somehow substantively defends Israel's actions, is more exercised over critics of Israel, like Finkelstein and so on. He's admitting the core charge of the mass murders, yet not just legally salient, but morally salient, obviously. Yet he's much more exercised over the alleged errors of critics of Israel the March, and also mad at the UN for publishing a report on the Great March of Return that he says made tertiary errors than he is over Israel for committing mass murder. So just a perverted sense of morality, no ability to handle moral priorities or discern them because he's so much in the debate mode. So let me first emphasize this point. Again, Lonerbox in the video admits the core charge that pro-Palestinians make concerning the Great March of Return, that Israel committed mass murder of protesters. Now, one might think, oh, well, maybe he's referring to bad apples, to ad hoc murders, and you could then make an argument that Israel doesn't have superior responsibility, or at least full superior responsibility, if they went contrary orders, but no. He recognizes that these aren't bad apples, his term, they're not bad apples, and he recognizes that the targeting decisions, these murders, were the product of superior orders from commanders, and that the murderers weren't punished.
At the beginning, this is not like a bad apples problem, because if anyone was using live ammunition, it was because a commander said that they could.
So there's no defense of Israel. This is murder, crimes against humanity, some of the worst, really short of genocide. Of course, this isn't genocide because of the scale. Some of the worst crimes a state could commit during the Great March of Return. So his position on the march is substantively quite similar to those of the alleged propagandists like me and Norman Finkelstein and others, whom he is committed to demeaning. So that's the strangest part of this. He agrees with us in the essential charge. Emphasis is so fascinating here and perverse. Lonerbox addresses the mass murders only very briefly. 5 minutes away or 6 minutes away from the end of the video when he admits these are murders, what Israel did repeatedly in the march. And when he does mention the murders, he expresses no concern for the victims, but he does fret at one point about how these crimes by Israel, namely murder, might harm Israel optically.
I love my Jewish friends, my Israeli friends. I'm like, fuck you, this you need to sort this shit out. It's really fucking bad. Because it makes you guys look bad as well.
What Lonerbox is actually most concerned with in the video is not Israeli mass murder, which again he acknowledges, but the alleged tertiary errors in a UN report on the Great March of Return. His discussion of these errors by these alleged errors in the UN report actually take up most of the last hour of his video. It's an hour and a half video. The first 30 minutes is basically an overview of the march, just factual mostly, not really taking a side in any issue. And the last hour is kind of his analysis, his normative takes, and most of this is about critiques of this UN report, and only briefly does he say, the mass murders were bad too, which he acknowledges again. Why is he so exercised of this UN report? Why is it so bad? He has more than one critique, but his main one is that the UN report found on the Great March of Return through 31 December 2018, at least 16%, or 29 out of 183, of the Gazans killed by the Israeli security forces were members of militant groups. And Lonerbox says, no, it was closer to 30%. I don't think Lonerbox's estimate is correct, and I'll mention why at the very end of the video. I think he's wrong to say that the figure was 30%. But let's say for argument's sake he's right on the militants killed count, right? Let's say he's right and the UN is wrong. I mean, the UN isn't wrong, even by his account, because they're saying at least 16%. They're not saying 16%, so that's weird that he says they're wrong when they're not, but let's say he's right, it's close to 30%. This would still provide no evidence, not a shred of evidence, that the Israeli security forces' rules of engagement were any less murderous than Israel's critics have said. And it's bizarre he's making this argument when he admits these rules of engagement permitted murder. He admits that they engaged in murder with superior command. So Lonerbox wants to use the fact that a high percentage of those Gazans killed were militants than has been described in the UN report. He wants to use this to make the Israeli security forces look better.
So it feels like if you've got such a disproportionate number of the deaths, because again, like, I don't think 30% of Gaza are militants. I feel like it's quite disproportionate. It would seem to be the case that there was at least some level of discernment when it came to militants, or what they considered to be inciters, and what they considered to be civilians, because of how many militants cross the threshold proportionately for getting killed, not just shot.
The problem with this argument is that Lonerbox is giving Israel credit, the ISF credit, for something they did unintentionally. For in the vast majority of cases where the ISF killed members of militant groups, ISF snipers would have had no way of knowing they were in fact militants. The vast majority of these people, of the members of the militant groups killed by Israel at the Great March of Return, were unarmed and out of uniform. They were mostly killed for walking toward the border fence unarmed. So how could Israel have possibly known these were members of the militant groups? This is a misleading sophism by Lonerbox, trying to give credit to Israel for more discerning rules of engagement than have been described by critics based on something they couldn't have known, namely an overrepresentation of the people they were killing were in militant groups, although still a relatively small minority of the total. He creates a false dichotomy of this effect, too. So he says, it's not a coincidence that such a large overrepresentation of militants were killed relative to the total population. Again, he says nearly 30% of those killed were militants. It's not a coincidence, but it doesn't have to mean that Israel knew they were militants. It's a totally false dichotomy. First of all, they're young and male, so that's one reason they're going to be overrepresented, because everyone killed in the march, young males were overrepresented, including civilians. Other reasons are that these people may have been ordered or encouraged by their superiors to engage in these risky activities, such as walking up to the border fence, or they could have the personalities to take these risks, and so on. There's many other explanations. Nevertheless, walking up to a border fence with unarmed does not constitute an act of war or active participation in hostilities when carried out by an unarmed person. So when Israel killed these people, even if they happened to be combatants, the Israelis had no idea they were when they shot them. So it's a bogus thing to give them credit for something they didn't know about. And as I said, overrepresented or not, members of militant groups were still, even according to Lonerbox's estimate, a relatively small minority of all Gazans killed. And if we control for age and gender, which again is something we should control for if you're looking at the overall Gazans killed, who including civilians were very likely to be young and male, the overrepresentation becomes much less dramatic, although it's still there, certainly. It's still quite substantial, but it's much less dramatic than Lonerbox is suggesting by talking about the percentage of the whole population that are in these militant groups. Lonerbox's use of the fact that the ISF in a minority of cases, like under 30% or just under, he says, unknowingly killed members of militant groups to try to defend their overall targeting practices is just pure sophistry. It's dishonesty. It's more apologetics for atrocities. In this case, trying to give people credit for something they didn't know about.
Yeah, they're like some of these killings were just murders. I think. I think that's probably fairly easy to say.
And the disingenuousness of this move is all the more apparent given that, again, I'll say for the 85th time, that Lonerbox admitted Israel committed mass murder in the Great March of Return, and that this was pursuant to superior orders. So how can you be defending the rules of engagement? I'll put that in quote marks, because there are no rules of engagement in a sense the Western military would have with these killers. They permitted murder, so it's absurd to try to defend Israel's conduct when you admit that they were engaged in murder. He acknowledges it's murder. He doesn't want to talk about this. His big issue is this tertiary error by the UN. He says that the UN undercounted the percentage of militants killed among the total persons killed in the Great March of Return. The UN says it was 16% at least through 31 December 2018, and Lonerbox says it was closer to 30%. Again, those statements are not incompatible, but we'll leave that aside. But say this is an error. Let's just assume for argument's sake this is an error. I don't think it is. But let's say it's an error. Still, Lonerbox's fixation on the error reveals a gross double standard when one compares how he treats this error with clearer, larger, and much more consequential errors in Israel's own propaganda reports on the Great March of Return. Specifically, Israel labeled as terrorists, meaning combatants, people you can kill, persons killed at the Great March of Return who were members of political parties who were civilians, including not just Hamas and PFLP, but Fatah. Fatah, I guess you'd say in Arabic. Fatah, not Fatah, whatever. Fatah is a fricking two-state solution, anti-violent resistance, and Israel's labeling these people killed civilian members of Fatah, as well as Hamas and PFLP, as terrorists. So they're just labeling civilians as combatants and justifying their murder. And this blatantly erroneous classification allowed Israel to falsely claim that the large majority of Gazans killed at the Great March of Return were combatants because they were claiming that civilian members of political parties, or affiliates, supposedly the majority of these people, the large majority, were affiliated with political parties in some way or another. No one knows what affiliate means. Israel doesn't know. But even if they were members of the party, they still would be civilians. Actually, Lonerbox recognizes this, to be fair, but Lonerbox never criticizes Israel for misclassifying politically active civilians as combatants. Never criticizes them for this.
Israeli intelligence, unfortunately, is kind of horseshit. At least these reports are. Like, their advocacy is really, really bad. It's like...
He can't plead ignorance of this error because he repeatedly read Israel's propaganda report on stream and relied on it in parts. How he reacts to the UN's alleged underestimation of militants killed versus Israel's blatant overcount, only really explicable by extreme pro-Israel bias on Lonerbox's part. In fact, Israel's error is far more egregious than the supposed error, in the UN report, about which Lonerbox is so adamant. For one, Israel's error is much more clear-cut than the UN's alleged error. So Israel's just blatantly counting civilian affiliates of political parties as terrorists or combatants by classifying murdered Palestinian affiliates of political parties as including members of Fatah, which rejects armed resistance, for fuck's sake. As killed terrorists and combatants, Israel's essentially justifying their killing or murder. Lonerbox's main takeaway from the Great March of Return is not that Israel committed mass murder. That's not what he's upset about. He admits they did, but he doesn't care much. He's really upset over a UN report in the Great March of Return that may have miscalculated the percentage of the dead who were members of militant groups. This points to perverted moral priorities on Lonerbox's part, which are akin to those of his benefactor Destiny. He wants to defend Israel, spin for Israel. If it's murder they commit, we'll do that. We'll spin for that. Strangely, he admits that, but the thrust of his video is still trying to say, the propagandists and the Palestinian side got this event wrong in these huge ways, and this UN report is bad. Lonerbox also engaged in dishonesty, lying, sophistry to defend Israel by claiming that the ISF should be credited for the fact that a significant minority of the persons they killed were militants, even though the ISF snipers had no way of knowing that the vast majority of them were in fact militants or combatants when they killed them. As I mentioned, they were unarmed and ununiformed. All right, I'll end on a little PS. His research largely consists of reading Google translated entries of martyrs on websites for militant groups. His total faith in this rather crude method belies the well-documented fact, which he never mentions in this video, may have mentioned elsewhere but not in this video, that Palestinian militant groups frequently erroneously claim persons killed by Israel as martyrs. The erroneous claim of a person by a militant group serves the interests of both parties. The heirs and assigns the decedents of the martyr benefit because they can claim financial compensation. Now, I'm not saying that his method is totally worthless. When a claimed martyr has a detailed biographical entry on the website of a militant group, especially with pictorial or video evidence, that is very compelling evidence that he was in fact a militant. Are they bringing these people to play dress up and shoot around and then they get killed later, and they're actually not militants and they get killed later? It's a stretch. I mean, it seems like very likely that they are militants if you have detailed biographical entries or photos, of them in action and so on. But these websites also feature many apparently false, fake claims to martyrs. So, for example, look at this guy. This is on the Al-Qassam website. I mean, give me a frickin' break, right? Regardless, it's the source he's using, and it's obviously ridiculous. This is a Photoshop picture. This is not actual bullets strewn across this man's chest. Let's tie this into the Great March of Return in Lonerbox's methodology. He counted, for example, as a militant, a paraplegic killed by Israel in the Great March of Return because he found him on the PAG website. Yet, the website provides no biographical information about this legless man. Supposed 10 years of PIG militant. His PIG photo looks fake to me. I'll let you be the judge of that. It looks like a Baldur's Gate picture to me. It looks edited. His face just doesn't look right to me.
18th, on the day, they returned 3 martyrs. One of whom was amputated in the front ranks. In his wheelchair. He went to the front row in his wheelchair. A fucking militant.
In any case, the website has no biographical information about the man. Why would they recruit a paraplegic? It's just absurd. In spite of the well-known practice of the militant groups erroneously claiming martyrs, this evidence, this picture, and a throwaway line that has no details about his supposed tenure in PIJ is enough for Lonerbox to write this guy off as a militant. And to justify his murder by the IDF, so it's like he was in a freaking wheelchair. I think he had a sling. Old man. The big issue concerning the Great March of Return is not whether the approximately 30% of those Gazans killed are militants, or whether at least 16% of those killed were militants. That's not really that important. The important issues are what I discussed, that Lonerbox has perverted moral priorities, that he is an apologist for murder, what he acknowledges as murder in this case, and that he engages in sophistry and dishonesty to try to give Israel credit for killing people they couldn't have possibly known were militants. Take care, everybody, and thank you for listening.